Sometimes life pivots on the smallest moments. A glance across a crowded room, a word spoken in anger, a shirt that tears at exactly the wrong time. For Maria Yazzie, a respected member of the White Mountain Apache tribe, that moment came on a sweltering July afternoon, when a stranger's carelessness would unravel everything she thought she knew about forgiveness, attraction, and the dangerous space between hatred and desire. What started as an ordinary day at the sunrise ceremonial grounds would become a story that her grandmother would later call the summer when the wind changed direction. Because sometimes the very person who destroys something precious in your life becomes the one who shows you what you never knew you were missing. This is the story of how one torn shirt, one reckless moment, and one woman's inability to look away would change the course of two lives forever. Maria Yazzie had always believed that some things in life were sacred and untouchable. The ceremonial shirt hanging on the wooden post behind her was one of them, made by her great-grandmother's hands nearly 70 years ago. Every bead, every thread, every carefully stitched symbol told a story of her family's connection to the Apache way. The shirt wasn't just clothing, it was memory woven into fabric, prayers sewn into seams, and love passed down through generations. She stood guard over the display at the annual sunrise ceremony celebration, watching as hundreds of visitors walked through the cultural exhibit. The July sun beat down mercilessly on the White Mountain Apache Reservation. But Maria remained at her post, sweat beading on her forehead as she answered questions about Apache traditions and kept watchful eyes on the precious artifacts surrounding her. The morning had started peacefully enough. Families gathered under the large ramadas, children chased each other between the food booths, and the sweet smell of fry bread mingled with sage smoke from the blessing ceremonies. Maria's cousin Jenny had stopped by earlier with her new baby, letting Maria hold the tiny girl wrapped in a traditional cradle board. For a moment, Maria had imagined what it would feel like to have her own child to carry on these traditions. At 32, Maria was considered by many in her community to be past the ideal age for marriage. She had focused instead on her work as a cultural preservationist, documenting Apache stories and maintaining the tribal museum. Her mother regularly reminded her that she was too picky and too serious, but Maria had never found a man who understood the depth of her connection to her heritage. The peaceful morning shattered when she heard the rumble of motorcycles approaching the ceremony grounds. Maria's stomach tightened as she watched three riders park their bikes near the main entrance. She could tell immediately they weren't from any of the local tribes. Their leather jackets, expensive bikes, and the casual way they walked through the sacred space marked them as tourists looking for an authentic Native American experience to post on social media. The leader of the group was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that looked like he'd just run his hands through it and skin tanned from hours in the sun. Maria noticed the way he moved with confident, almost careless steps, touching things he shouldn't touch, taking photos without asking permission. His two companions followed his lead, laughing loudly and pointing at the traditional dancers who were preparing for the afternoon ceremony. Maria watched as the man approached her exhibit area, his green eyes scanning the display cases with what looked like genuine interest. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe she had judged him too harshly. Perhaps he was one of those rare visitors who truly wanted to learn about Apache culture, rather than just collect exotic experiences. "These are incredible," he said, stopping in front of a case containing traditional Apache baskets. His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't place, and when he smiled at her, Maria felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach. "How old are they?" "The oldest basket is from the 1890s, Maria replied, maintaining her professional tone despite the way his smile seemed to light up his entire face. "It was made by my great-great-grandmother for carrying water and pinyon nuts. Your family made these?" He leaned closer to the glass and Maria caught a scent of leather and something else, something masculine and warm that made her suddenly aware of how close he was standing. "That's amazing. You must feel so connected to your history." Maria nodded, surprised by his genuine interest. Most tourists wanted quick explanations and photo opportunities. This man seemed to actually understand the significance of what he was looking at. "I'm Jake," he said, extending his hand. "Jake Morrison. I'm traveling through the area with my friends, and I have to say, this is the most authentic cultural experience I've had in years of traveling." "Maria," she replied, shaking his hand and trying to ignore the way his touch sent a small electric shock up her arm. "And yes, maintaining our cultural traditions is very important to our community." For the next hour, Jake stayed near her exhibit, asking thoughtful questions about Apache history, listening intently as Maria explained the significance of different ceremonial objects, and even purchasing a small piece of traditional pottery from the gift area. Maria found herself warming to him despite her initial reservations. He spoke respectfully about the importance of preserving indigenous cultures and shared stories of his travels to various tribal communities across the Southwest. His friends, however, grew increasingly impatient. Maria could see them checking their phones and making pointed looks in Jake's direction. Finally, the shorter of the two men approached. "Come on, Jake," he said loudly. "We've got to get going if we want to make Phoenix by tonight." "This place is interesting, but we've seen enough." Jake looked torn, glancing between Maria and his friends. "Can you give me just a few more minutes? I'm learning so much here." "Dude, seriously?" The friend's voice carried an edge of irritation. "We've got dinner reservations at that steakhouse you wanted to try, the one with the mechanical bull." Maria felt something cold settle in her stomach. Of course. This was just another stop on their tourist adventure, wedged between the Grand Canyon and whatever artificial Wild West experience awaited them in Phoenix. She had been foolish to think Jake's interest was anything more than surface-level curiosity. "You should go," she said quietly, turning her attention back to arranging some jewelry in the display case. "I'm sure Phoenix has many exciting attractions waiting for you." Jake caught the change in her tone immediately. "Maria, wait. It's not like that. I'm genuinely interested in learning more about your culture." "Learning enough for a good story to tell at dinner, I'm sure," Maria replied, not looking up from her work. "That's not fair," Jake said, and there was something in his voice that made Maria look at him again. His green eyes were serious, almost hurt. "I know how this looks, but I'm not some tourist looking for a cheap thrill. I've been studying Native American cultures for years. I'm actually working on a book about the preservation of indigenous traditions in the modern world." Maria felt a flicker of doubt about her harsh judgment, but before she could respond, Jake's friends had moved closer, their impatience clearly reaching its limit. "Jake, come on," the taller friend called out. "We need to hit the road now if we don't want to ride in the dark." In his hurry to respond to his friends while still trying to continue his conversation with Maria, Jake took a step backward. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, each second stretching out like a nightmare Maria would replay in her mind for weeks to come. Jake's elbow caught the corner of the wooden post where her great-grandmother's ceremonial shirt hung. The post wobbled for a moment, and Maria lunged forward, her hand outstretched, desperately trying to steady it, but she was too late. The post toppled over, and the precious shirt fell directly onto the small campfire that had been burning nearby for the sage blessing ceremony. The ancient fabric, dry from decades of careful storage, caught fire immediately. Maria screamed and dove toward the flames, trying to pull the shirt from the fire, but Jake's strong hands grabbed her wrists and pulled her back. "Don't!" he shouted. "You'll burn yourself!" Maria fought against his grip, tears streaming down her face as she watched 70 years of her family's history turn to ash and smoke. The beadwork that her great-grandmother had sewn by candlelight, the symbols that told the story of her family's clan, the prayers that had been whispered into every stitch. All of it was disappearing before her eyes. By the time Jake released her and found a bucket of water to douse the flames, there was nothing left but charred remains and the acrid smell of burnt cotton and melted beads. Maria knelt beside the smoking pile, her hands trembling as she tried to salvage anything at all. A few beads that had survived the fire rolled between her fingers, but they were blackened and cracked. "Maria, I'm so sorry," Jake said, kneeling beside her. "I'm so incredibly sorry. Tell me how to fix this. Tell me what I can do." Maria looked up at him through her tears, and for the first time since meeting him, she saw him clearly. She saw the careless way he moved through the world, assuming that his charm and good intentions could smooth over any damage he caused. She saw the expensive motorcycle and designer clothes that marked him as someone who had never known what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. She saw everything she had been trying to protect her community from. "You can't fix this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can never fix this." Jake's face went pale as he seemed to fully grasp what had just happened. "There has to be something. I'll pay for restoration, or I'll find someone who can recreate it exactly, or..." "It was made by my great-grandmother's hands," Maria said, standing and backing away from him. "It was blessed by our medicine man. It carried 70 years of prayers and ceremonies. You think money can replace that? You think some stranger can just make another one?" "Maria, please," Jake stepped toward her, but she held up her hand to stop him. "Get away from me," she said, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Take your friends and your motorcycles and get off our land. Now." Jake opened his mouth as if to argue, but something in Maria's eyes must have warned him against it. His friends, who had been standing awkwardly nearby during the entire incident, moved closer. "Come on, man," the shorter one said quietly. "We should go." Jake looked back at Maria one more time, his face a mixture of regret and something else she couldn't identify. "I'm truly sorry," he said. "More sorry than you'll ever know." Maria turned her back on him and didn't watch as the three men walked away. She didn't look up when their motorcycles roared to life. She stayed kneeling beside the remains of her great-grandmother's shirt till long after the sound of their engines had faded into the distance. By evening, word of what had happened had spread throughout the reservation. Maria's grandmother, a tiny woman with silver braids who had lived through 93 winters, came to sit beside her granddaughter as the sun set behind the mountains. "Tell me what happened, child," she said gently. Maria told her everything, from Jake's initial interest in the cultural exhibits to the moment when everything went wrong. Her grandmother listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "And how do you feel about this man?" her grandmother asked when Maria had finished. "I hate him," Maria said immediately. "He destroyed something precious and irreplaceable." Her grandmother was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Hate is a heavy burden to carry," she finally said. "But sometimes the Creator puts difficult people in our path for reasons we don't understand right away." "What possible reason could there be for this?" Maria asked, gesturing toward the pile of ash that had once been her family's treasure. "I don't know," her grandmother admitted, "but I've lived long enough to learn that the people who hurt us the most sometimes have the most important lessons to teach us." Maria couldn't imagine what lesson she was supposed to learn from Jake Morrison's carelessness. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the disaster, she tried to push away the memory of his genuine distress when he realized what had happened. She tried to forget the way his eyes had looked when she told him to leave. Most of all, she tried to ignore the way her heart had raced during their conversation, before everything went wrong. But despite her anger and grief, Maria couldn't shake the image of Jake's face from her mind. And that night, for the first time in years, she dreamed of green eyes and gentle hands, even as her heart broke for everything that had been lost. 3 weeks passed, and Maria threw herself into her work with an intensity that worried her family. She stayed late at the tribal museum, cataloging artifacts and updating cultural preservation records. She volunteered for extra shifts at the community center, teaching traditional weaving to young girls who giggled at her serious demeanor, anything to keep her mind off the memory of green eyes and the smell of smoke. The burned remains of her great-grandmother's shirt sat in a special box on her dresser at home. She couldn't bring herself to throw them away, but looking at them brought fresh waves of grief and anger. Her mother had suggested a cleansing ceremony to help her move past the incident, but Maria wasn't ready. The hurt was still too raw, the sense of violation too fresh. On a Thursday morning that started like any other, Maria was updating the museum's computer files when her cousin Jenny burst through the front door, her baby strapped to her chest and excitement radiating from her face. "Maria, you're not going to believe this," Jenny said, slightly out of breath from running. "There's a white guy at the community center asking about Apache beadwork classes. And get this, he's driving a motorcycle." Maria's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "What does he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, really green eyes. Kind of handsome in a rugged way. And he's got this guilty look on his face, like he's done something wrong." Jenny paused, studying her cousin's expression. "Wait, do you know this guy?" Maria's hands began to tremble as she saved her work and shut down the computer. "What exactly did he say he wanted?" "He said he wanted to learn traditional Apache beadwork techniques. When Mrs. Begay told him the classes were only for tribal members, he said he was willing to pay for private lessons." He seemed really serious about it, Maria. Not like those tourists who just want to make a dream catcher for their Instagram. Maria grabbed her keys and headed for the door, her mind racing. What was Jake Morrison doing back on the reservation? And why was he asking about beadwork? The coincidence seemed too strange to be accidental. "Where are you going?" Jenny called after her. "To find out what game he's playing," Maria replied grimly. The community center was only a 5-minute drive from the museum, but it felt like an eternity as Maria's imagination ran wild with possible explanations for Jake's return. Was he some kind of artifact collector looking to buy traditional items? Was he researching a story that would exploit their community? Or worse, Was he one of those people who'd collected indigenous cultures like trophies, moving from tribe to feed his own sense of worldly sophistication? She parked her truck next to a familiar motorcycle and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Through the community center's window, she could see Jake sitting across from Mrs. Begay, the elderly woman who had been teaching traditional crafts for over 40 years. He was listening intently as she spoke, occasionally nodding and taking notes in a small leather journal. Maria watched him for several minutes before getting out of her truck. He looked different from her memories. His clothes were simpler, less obviously expensive. His hair was a bit longer, and there was something in his posture that suggested humility rather than the confident swagger she remembered. But what struck her most was the way he handled the small examples of beadwork that Mrs. Begay was showing him. His touch was reverent, careful, as if he understood the value of what he was holding. Taking a deep breath, Maria pushed open the community center door. The conversation stopped immediately as both Jake and Mrs. Begay looked up at her entrance. Jake's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, guilt, hope, and something that looked almost like relief. Begay said warmly, "This young man has been asking about learning beadwork. I told him our classes are for community members only, but he seems very sincere in his interest." Jake stood slowly, his green eyes never leaving Maria's face.
"Hello, Maria. What are you doing here?"
Maria's voice was steady, but inside she felt like she was falling apart all over again. "I came back to learn," Jake said simply. "I came back to understand what I destroyed." Begay looked between them with growing interest. "Do you two know each other?" "He's the one," Maria said quietly, "the one who burned great-grandmother's shirt." The elderly woman's expression changed immediately, her kind eyes growing hard as she studied Jake with new attention. "I see. And you think learning beadwork will somehow make up for that?" "No," Jake said, meeting her stare directly. "I don't think anything can make up for it. But I realized I can't live with myself without at least trying to understand what I took away." Maria felt a surge of anger at his presumption. "You can't just take a few beading classes and suddenly understand 70 years of family history." "You're right," Jake agreed, surprising her. "I can't, but I can try to understand the work and skill and love that went into creating something like that. I can try to learn enough to appreciate what was lost." Mrs. Begay studied him for a long moment. "Why should we teach our sacred arts to someone who has already proven he doesn't respect them?" "Because maybe the person who has caused the most damage is the one who most needs to learn respect," Jake replied. "And because I'm not going anywhere until I do." Maria stared at him. "What do you mean you're not going anywhere?" "I rented a cabin outside town. I've arranged to work remotely for the next few months. I'm staying until I can learn enough to truly understand what I destroyed." Jake's voice was quiet but determined. "I know you probably think this is some kind of guilt-driven publicity stunt, but it's not. I can't sleep, Maria. I can't stop thinking about the look on your face when that shirt burned. I can't move forward with my life until I've done something to honor what was lost." Mrs. Begay and Maria exchanged glances. The older woman's expression had softened slightly, though she still looked skeptical. "Even if someone were willing to teach you?" "Mrs. Kaplan," Begay said carefully, "traditional beadwork takes years to master. The techniques have been passed down through generations. It's not something you learn in a weekend workshop." "I understand," Jake said. "I have time." "And what makes you think anyone here would want to spend that time teaching you?" Maria asked, though her anger was beginning to mix with something else, something she didn't want to name. Jake was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Nothing makes me think that. I'm asking, not demanding. If the answer is no, then I'll leave and never bother you again. But if there's even a small chance that someone might be willing to help me understand what I destroyed, then I have to try." Mrs. Begay stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. "Maria, I think you and this young man need to have a conversation. A real one. I'll be in the kitchen making tea if you need me." After she left, Jake and Maria stood in awkward silence for several minutes. Finally, Jake gestured toward 2 chairs near the window. "Will you sit with me for a moment, please?" Against her better judgment, Maria took a seat across from him. This close, she could see the dark circles under his eyes, the signs of sleepless nights that matched her own. "I need you to know something," Jake said. "That day when my friends were rushing me, when I knocked over the post, it wasn't just carelessness. I was torn between wanting to stay and talk with you longer and feeling pressure to. I was distracted because I was attracted to you, because our conversation was the most genuine connection I'd felt with another person in months, maybe years. That doesn't excuse what happened, but I need you to know it wasn't that you and your culture didn't matter to me. Maria felt her heart skip a beat, but she forced herself to remain focused. Attraction doesn't repair burned shirts or bring back family heirlooms. No, it doesn't, Jake agreed. But it explains why I can't just write this off as an unfortunate accident and move on with my life. It explains why I've spent the last 3 weeks researching Apache culture and traditional crafts. It explains why I quit my job and came back here. You quit your job? Maria couldn't hide her surprise. I was a marketing consultant for tech companies. Good money, flexible schedule, perfect for funding my travel addiction. But after what happened here, going back to writing advertising copy for apps and websites felt meaningless. Jake ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Maria remembered from their first meeting. I realized I've been wandering around the world collecting experiences without ever really understanding or respecting the cultures I was visiting. I was exactly the kind of tourist I thought I was different from. Despite herself, Maria felt a tiny crack forming in the wall of anger she had built around her heart. So you decided to become a different kind of tourist, one who stays longer. I decided to try to become someone worthy of the forgiveness I don't deserve. I decided to stop being a tourist altogether and start being a student. Maria studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, she saw exhaustion, sincerity, and something that looked like genuine grief. It was the same expression she had seen on his face the day the shirt burned, the moment when he realized the magnitude of what had been lost. Mrs. Begay is right about beadwork taking years to learn, Maria said slowly. My grandmother started teaching me when I was 7, and I'm still learning new techniques. I know. I've been reading about it, about the spiritual significance of the patterns, about how the colors have meaning, about how each piece tells a story. Jake leaned forward slightly. I'm not trying to become an expert in 3 months. I'm trying to understand enough to honor what was lost. And then what? You learn some basic beadwork and feel better about yourself and go back to your old life? Jake was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I don't know what comes next. This is the first time in my adult life that I've made a decision based on something other than what would be most convenient or profitable for me. I'm kind of making it up as I go. Despite everything, Maria felt the corners of her mouth twitch upward slightly. There was something endearing about his honesty, even if she didn't trust his motives completely. Traditional Apache beadwork isn't just about learning techniques, she said. It's about understanding the stories, the prayers, the cultural context that gives the work meaning. Are you prepared for that? I hope so, Jake said. Will you teach me? The question hung in the air between them. Maria felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether the ground beneath her feet was solid or if taking one more step would send her tumbling into unknown territory. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Of course, Jake said, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. I'm staying at the Pine Ridge Cabins if you decide you want to talk more. As Maria drove home that afternoon, her mind churned with conflicting emotions. Part of her was still furious at Jake's presumption and thinking he could somehow make amends by learning beadwork. Part of her was suspicious of his motives and convinced this was all an elaborate way to ease his guilt without making any real sacrifice. But another part of her, a part she tried to suppress, was intrigued by the idea of teaching him. Not because she believed he could truly understand the depth of what had been lost, but because she had seen something in his eyes that day, something that suggested he might actually be capable of the kind of respect and reverence her culture deserved. That evening, as she sat with her grandmother sharing dinner and talking about the day's events, the older woman listened thoughtfully to Maria's account of Jake's return. What does your heart tell you? Her grandmother asked. My heart is confused, Maria admitted. I'm angry at him for destroying something precious, but I'm also angry at myself for being attracted to him. And I'm angry at the whole situation for being so complicated. Her grandmother smiled. Anger and attraction often walk hand in hand, child. The people who can hurt us the most deeply are usually the ones we allow closest to our hearts. But I don't want him close to my heart, Maria protested. I barely know him. Don't you? Her grandmother asked gently. You knew him well enough to trust him with your family's story that day. You knew him well enough to be disappointed when you thought he was just another tourist. And you know him well enough now to be torn about whether to trust him again. That night, as Maria lay in bed listening to the wind in the pines outside her window, she found herself thinking about Jake's hands. The way they had touched Mrs. Begay's beadwork examples so carefully. The way they had pulled her back from the fire to protect her from burning herself. The way they had trembled slightly when he talked about not being able to sleep. She thought about his eyes too. The way they had lit up when she first told him about her family's baskets. The way they had filled with genuine distress when the shirt caught fire. The way they had looked almost hopeful when he asked if she would teach him. Maybe her grandmother was right. Maybe the people who could hurt you the most were the ones you let close to your heart. But maybe, just maybe, they were also the ones capable of healing the deepest wounds, if you were brave enough to let them try. The next morning, Maria drove to Pine Ridge Cabins before she could change her mind.